Hello again, students, freaks, dorks, and sycophants. It's time for another live stream, and I'm sorry that we missed last week. I had some things to do, and things got in the way, but that's okay. We were in between series, so that's okay. Uh, Last we were doing was bad habits in the church, and now we're kind of jumping into good habits in the church. And to that end, we're going to be starting in with this book by David Platt, Counterculture. David Platt's an interesting guy, but his points are quite good. And if you are in the 181 Youth Ministry, this will kind of dovetail nicely, especially today with our series in the book of Judges. For those who may be tuning in, aren't part of Parmites Baptist Church. J.D. Greer has a great series on Judges. If it's on Right Now Media, if you're interested in checking that out. But also, if you're part of the young adult ministry of PHBC, you've already wrapped this up, I believe. So I might just be retreading old ground, but I'm going to look at this and I'm going to add my own spin a little bit. I'm going to cover the points and add some things that I'd like to bring up about it and how these demonstrate good habits in the church. Now, that having been said, let me tell you, the first week isn't really a habit. Because in order to get anywhere in terms of being anything with this book, we've got to lay down the bedrock. So let's get started there. In order to have some good habits in the church. If you're paying attention to our series at Parmites doing the Who Stole My Church, just recently Pastor Shane did a sermon rather, documenting how the church has changed over the years. But part of that change was that occasionally, especially in the early days of the church was on the outs with society. In fact, historically, the church has operated almost best when it's out of society. I mean, remember all those verses about the world hating us? In case you forgot, here's two. John 15, verses 18 through 19. If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. That's Jesus. Clear as day. If you love me, people are going to have a problem with you. But even in Timothy 3:12, Paul says, indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Jesus Christ will be persecuted. And I don't mean to push up persecution complex, but we're going to face some blowback at the very least. People are not going to be jazzed by what we believe. And that's kind of the habit we have to accept, that as a church, we shouldn't be canonized into culture. And if you're wondering, what does that mean? It means we should not be part of any one culture. You shouldn't be able to look at England or France or the United States and say, that's a Christian culture. I mean, it'd be nice if you could, and the Bible does say, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. But what has happened as of late, I fear, is that we've become canonized in that instead of trying to shape the hearts of the people, we've tried to make the culture like us, and in the process of became kind of intertwined. And we become just another facet. Instead of being a moral center or pillar, we're just another facet of American culture. Remember what I said about a missionary I know in the Ukraine who said, when you go on a mission, you have to strip away 50% of what the American church taught you. You have to get rid of that canonical culture, because when you get into there, you lose your edge. We as a church sometimes lose our edge. Some churches have completely lost their edge because they've gotten so ingratiated into this game of trying to be American or make America Christian that they forget what their mission is. It kind of reminds me of the movie Rocky 3. In the movie Rocky 3, Rocky Balboa is riding the high of his success. He's famous. He's beaten all these other fighters. He's a boxer, if you've never seen the movie. And one of the things that happens to him is he gets soft. He just starts enjoying the fame. He enjoys the lifestyle, the wealth, and he's lost his edge. He's not training. He's just living it up. He's just deciding this is boxing life, the fame. So when a rival, Clubber Lang, played by Mr. T, shows up, Rocky gets pounded because he's just living up the fame. And he finds out from his old rival, Greef Karga of The Mandalorian, Apollo Creed, that he lost what he called the eye of the tiger. Rocky wasn't hungry anymore. He was soft. He was just trying to soak up the life of a professional boxer that he forgot to be a boxer. And this is what has happened to many churches or even some believers. We've become just ingratiated into the culture of going to church, voting for the right guy, believing this checklist of things, doing this thing, that we forgot that these things are just more societal than biblical. We've lost our saltiness, as Jesus would say. We become more worried about being of the culture by making the culture like us instead of remembering what Jesus told us, that we're outsiders. And I'm not saying we should become some kind of separate cult and never interact with anybody, but rather what it means is when there's a little bit of when there's going to be disagreement, don't be surprised. And you're going to have moments where you're just going to have to choose between, do I have this friendship or do I trust my relationship in Jesus? This is going to be a choice you might have to make. Because when we try to make the outside world like us, we stop being the church and start being hypocrites. We lose that eye of the tiger and we become concerned with our merchandising, our political power, the right music, the right appearance, the right activities, whatever. And we do it at the expense of our integrity. The process of that is we lose the trust of people. I mean, look, students, look at your generation. How many people in your school trust the church? How many people view it as an old, backward, medieval, hateful institution full of ignorant people? Part of that, I'm going to posit, is that some churches and believers have forgotten who we are. It's that hyper-Orthodox or even hyper-liberal. We've tried to accommodate everybody, and we've kind of lost our standard. So what are we? Well, I can tell you biblically, we're not men, we're not women, we're not American or German or young or old. We are Christ followers, first and foremost. We are his children, and to that end, we are going to be different and foreigners from the rest of the world. So with that in mind, we're supposed to be that, stand out as that separate pillar of hope. Set apart. In fact, that's what sanctified means, set apart. We're not trying to get into the culture and think it's going to change. We're going to change it for the better. We're not going to get into it and just try to be cool and accommodate everybody. We're supposed to be here, inviting everyone else and showing us the hope that we have. And this doesn't mean that we're trying to be hellraisers and raise Cain. And if you don't know what that means, Google it. But it does mean that we're going to take some issues that come under fire. But we could still be a positive force on our own. We're set apart. We're a counterculture for him. We shouldn't be hyper-Orthodox or hyper-lenient. And before we get into any habits of a good church, we have to remember perhaps the first thing that David mentions in chapter 1, the most counterculture thing about us, that if we forget this, then if we lose sight of this, then the church is incapable of being successful. Then it's going to be caught in the waves of either trying to accommodate everybody or just get caught up on unessential things. And that first essential thing is the gospel. Now, for those who might be tuning in that you don't know what I mean by the gospel means good news. And essentially, if I were to explain it quickly, it's the idea that God made mankind to be in relationship with him. God wanted us, people, to hang out with him. And when we were first made, we were perfect. No sin, no bad, nothing. Everything was perfect. But then, because of a disobedient act, that Garden of Eden fruit, we had sin. And sin is, think of it like a contagion. We've been going through a quarantine, and if someone got COVID, you couldn't let them in your house because you didn't want to spread the illness. And that's what sin is to God. When God makes something perfect, like a Garden of Eden, for example, when sin enters, it corrupts it. And that's what happened to earth. So the problem is, because of sin, everything we touch, even the good stuff, can be tainted. And we are incapable of getting back and having that relationship with God because of our sin. Because of this contagion in us, we cannot be good enough to get back to heaven or God's mercy. But in his mercy and sense of justice, God provided us with Jesus, who sacrificed himself for us and resurrected. And in doing so, anybody who believed in that would have their sins removed. Now, that doesn't mean they stop being a sinner, but what it means is we stop having that eternal penalty, that Jesus took away the penalty. And now when we stand before God after we die, we don't have that pall, that disease hanging over us, preventing us from being back in communion with him. But it's only in faith in Jesus, in his work, not our own, that this happens. And that sounds pretty good, I guess, if you're thinking about it, but it comes with a few caveats that people have problems with. And that's even before if you believe in God. You might believe in God, but there's a few things about that when you look at it in a closer lens, as David does, it definitely smacks against what the world wants to see. For example, God forgives. You think, how is that countercultural? Well, listen. The serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, when he died, allegedly died a Christian. And by all our understanding, he really was a believer, which means a serial killer is in heaven. Now think of an atheist who is a charity worker, who was an otherwise upright person. Well, because they were an atheist and didn't believe in God, guess where they aren't? Heaven. We don't like that, do we? That charity worker earned it. Jeffrey Dahmer deserves to be in hell, right? But that's just the problem, isn't it? The charity worker did the work, but remember what it says in Ephesians 2:8-9. For it is by grace that you have been saved, through faith. This is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. It's not about what we did. And consider also the parable of the vineyard workers in Matthew 20, verses 1-16. Basically, it's a story where a guy went out, hired a bunch of people to work his vineyard, and he kept throughout the day hiring people to work his vineyard. And in the last hour of the day, he hired some more people still. And when it came time for payday, everyone got the same pay. And the workers who started earlier said, "This isn't fair. We've been here longer." And the paymaster said, "Everybody gets the same wages because you worked for me." Which means that the guy, be it serial killer or not, when he dies on their deathbed, if they have a confession, they still get to heaven. We don't like that. We think it's not fair. We want to be the judge. Oh, but that's our point number 2. Don't judge me. God calls us all in need of his grace because our hearts are all dark. But we don't like that. I'm happy to call someone else evil, but I don't want to be called that. And God says, well, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Romans 3:23. We don't like that. I find it interesting today that a lot of films, we try to paint the bad guy good and the good guy bad because everybody's got some bad in us. Oh, but when God says that, how dare you? So that's because we don't want a definitive lawgiver. And we also don't like that standard because it brings us to point three. I want to be in charge. I want to be the one making the law standard, not you. I don't want you to judge me, and I don't want you to send Dahmer to heaven because I have the standard and I want to be in charge. You know, that old feeling from the garden where the serpent tricked Eve and said, "You'll be as God," that's still alive today as it was back then. In 181 ministry, we're going through Judges, as I said, and there's that very famous line about Judges that encapsulates the whole thing. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that's what we want. We want a bare minimum standard of morality. So just don't kill, don't lie. And that's all happy, hunky dory. But then we want no judge standards after that. Or rather, I want to be the one that decides good and evil. Or I want to be the one that says lying is bad unless. And you don't want someone else, and certainly not some God, to be the one to call you on it. I am a God to myself. The gospel speaks directly against that, which is kind of the final problem. I want to be the one to decide. I want to be the God. I'm thinking about people today in our country. We have a lot of conspiracy theorists and pseudo experts, people that when they hear something they don't like, they feel like, well, if I don't agree with it, it's not true. If I don't agree with that statement, it's not true. And we believe we have the right to decide truth or falsehood. And the gospel calls us out on that and says, no, you don't decide the standard. Jesus does not need us to agree with his existence for his existence to be true, any more than I can disagree with a tree in my front yard but it's there. So that's the problem. I want to create my own reality. I want my own way. And the Bible says, well, sorry, but there is a standard. And I'll tell you, people in younger generations, even my generation, that's anathema. As long as I'm good, I can do whatever else I want. The gospel says, well, you're not good enough. So no, you don't get that right. The Bible, in fact, says instead of trust in yourselves and see what's right for you, the Bible says trust in God and look to him to what's best for you. Not a very popular thing. And that also means that in addition that we can't be too lenient, it also means we can't be too strict. We can't make up standards that aren't there. We can't decide, well, this is what I want God to be, so therefore he is. We can't just decide that. We see that how many times have you seen a Christian excuse locker room talk? I have. We claim that we all have to be moral, but when the pastor's buddy says something crude online, oh, that's okay. It's just locker room talk. I was just reading Ephesians 5 about that, and there's nothing in there that says that's okay. Oh, well, it's different because they're the right person or they have the right letter behind their name. That too is hypocritical, and that's running along with the culture, because the culture will always give an exception, whereas the Bible says, no, that's not true. So we can't be selective. That's how churches can mess it up. They can either be not enforcing the truth enough, or they just are selective about when they want to. But the gospel tells us, no, you don't get to decide that. And as for the rest of society, the gospel is something that even if you believe in God, you don't like the idea of a definitive, well, this is the only way to heaven. And as John 15:5 says, I am the vine. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That actually might be Luke 14:6, but call me if I'm wrong. But we don't like that. And that's the bottom line about church and counterculture. Before we get into these good habits, the first good habit is to recognize that we're set apart. And that doesn't mean we're better than other people, but we need to remember that we're not trying to be like them. We're not trying to cater to everybody not Christian. We're not trying to judge anybody not Christian. We're trying to be us for God. Jesus is the fulcrum, and we are going to be a set apart pillar if we live by that. With that comes stances that are helpful. Some are difficult to accept for some people at times, but all are designed for our best by God. So things that are countercultural to society and traditional church. But regardless, it's all based on the gospel, which runs counter to everything. So we stick to the gospel. We're not going to be too much for one group or too much against group, and we're going to avoid some hypocrisy. We're going to remember of who we are. And it's liberating because now we don't have to placate one group or another. We could just be ourselves, which is going to be important because as we cover some of these issues, as I've said before, with red party, blue party, which party do I join? No party properly represents the church. So why are we too busy trying to make sure we fit into one? We have liberation to be ourselves. So to that end, next week we're going to cover something that's not necessarily easy for some fundamental traditional Christians, and that is the gospel of poverty and how the church ought to be handling it. Some churches handle it well, and some do not. So we're going to be discussing that. And so I'm looking forward to this journey with you, and I'm looking forward to reading this book. So have a good time.